Terrence Roberts.
Invitation for me to come tonight and join this outbreak of recognition for Dr. King. You know, it's an amazing thing. You look back in time, 1957, but even further back than that for me, because as a young kid, I realized something was amiss in Little Rock. Something was not right. I didn't know what it was. I was too young to know. So those very early years were fraught with lots of questions. As a first grader, I remember going to Miss Waugh's class at Gibbs Elementary. Dunbar was a middle school. Miss Waugh said to us 6-year-olds, she said, "You kids, you must take on executive responsibility for learning." Now that's quite a large thing to say to a group of 6-year-olds. But there was something inside me that was prepared for that. I don't know if you believe in this sort of stuff, but sometimes you are leading up to something. You don't know what it is, but when you see it, when you feel it, when you touch it, you know what it is. When she spoke those words, there was a resonance. And I established the Terry Roberts Learning Academy in September of 1947. And that academy has been full-blown since. Dues paid, no late fees. Why? Because learning is paramount. All of us suffer from the disease of ignorance. I admit freely, the largest thing I own is a storehouse of ignorance. My goal is that by my end date, that storehouse will be diminished. I will continue to learn. It's imperative, and I preach this gospel to kids as many times as I can, because I think a lot of kids today, because of the way society has been structured, have been lost in terms of the efforts to educate self, to take on that executive responsibility. I have 2 grandsons, so I know what I'm talking about. Now, they're not dumb kids. They know a lot. But they're not learning. But in any case, we're not here to talk about them. I'm going to say a few words about Little Rock, and then we're going to spend our time talking about other things. And I think Little Rock's an important place to start, because it was a microcosm of all of the stuff that's wrong with us as a society. There were people in Little Rock who were in that mob who I could tell by looking were grandparents, because they were holding the hands of their grandkids as they marched outside the school and yelled obscenities at us, the 9. And I felt compassion for those little kids. Who's going to watch out for those guys? What are they learning from those grandparents? What ideologies are they absorbing? I was powerless to do anything, but I said I'm going to commit myself to learning how to do that. So now I try to speak to kids every time I have a chance, to encourage them to take on people who try to interrupt their progress as humans. A few years ago, I was invited by the Kentucky State Department of Education to come and review social studies textbooks. I said, yes, I'll take that on. I think they had in mind that I would review these books to make sure that the information in there was useful for kids of color. That's what I thought. The other thing I thought was, I will find problems. I was very clear about that. There will be stuff that has to be changed or eliminated. But I was unprepared for what I did find. I just opened the book, the social studies textbook, to the part on Dr. Martin Luther King. And it started off with this sentence, and I quote, "Dr. King was a great leader for black people." I closed the book. I said, if this is characteristic of what else is in here, it's not worth my reading. And I reported this to the educators there in Kentucky. I don't know if they changed a thing. I don't know if they were willing to change it in the first place. I think probably I was brought there just for window dressing, so they could say this has been vetted by one of the Little Rock. No, I've had that happen. At any rate, that is not the only time I've read stuff like that. For centuries, black people in the United States have been relegated to the margins of society, considered to be outside the realm of meaningful social change. So how could Martin Luther King be anything but a leader for black people? James McCune Smith, a physician and pharmacist, saw what could happen when the mind turns from reason to create mental images of black people that have nothing whatsoever to do with objective reality. In 1852, underline that date, 1852, in a fiery speech decrying the invention of race, he wrote, "The Negro with us is not an actual physical being of flesh and bones and blood, but a hideous monster of the mind, ugly beyond all physical portraying, so utterly and ineffably monstrous as to frighten reason from its throne, justice from its balance, and mercy from its hallowed temple, and to blot out shame and probity and the internal sympathies of nature, so far as these things have presence in the breast and being of American Republicans. No, sir, it is a constructive Negro, a John Roe and Richard Doe Negro that haunts with grim presence the precincts of this republic, shaking his gory locks over legislative halls and family prayers." That was James McCune Smith in 1852. Now, Smith was able to see the profound impact of eternalized belief systems as they were played out in his 19th century existence. Akin to that report, we have these words from the man who was to become our 16th president, then Senator Abraham Lincoln. "Mammon is after him, ambition follows, philosophy follows, and the theology of the day is fast joining the fray. They have him in his prison house. They have him searched. They've left no prying instrument upon him with which he might be able to try to open the heavy iron doors which close upon him. And now they have him, as it were, bolted in with locks 100-fold, and each of the 100 keys in the hands of 100 men scattered to distant and vast parts of the universe, scattered across the world. And they stand, these 100 stand out there musing as to what invention in all the dominions of mind and matter can be produced to make the impossibility of his escape more complete than it is." That's from soon-to-be President Lincoln. That statement was made in 1857 in the wake of the Dred Scott decision. We don't have time to talk about that, but I would encourage you to read the story of Dred Scott as well. Lincoln, James McCune Smith, both of them, they could not have known how prescient their statements were. But it was absolutely true. It was true then. It is true in 2024. Similarly, Dr. Smith's analysis was prescient then, and it has withstood the test of time. Dr. King was well aware of this reality. In his estimate, the United States suffered from a soul sickness. It was his intent to teach and speak with conviction about this sickness. But, and always, there's that troubling group of people, that conjunction, the but. Even though he was saying this, his efforts were to be minimized, relegated to the corners. Bernard Malamud wrote a novel called The Fixer, sometime during the 60s, I can't remember the date. But there was one sentence in that book that stood out to me, and I will always remember. Bernard Malamud writes this: "In a sick country, any sign of health is seen as an insult to those who live off the sickness." Think about how much money was made on the backs of black people enslaved for those hundreds of years. That sickness led to great wealth for them. Anybody who would change that system had to confront them, and they were not willing to have it. Ergo, it lasted for as long as it did. They went down fighting. They're still fighting. Dr. King's knowledge increased rapidly over the course of his shortened life. He outgrew the confining limits of the black-white binary and saw the capitalistic imperative. He talked about the scourge of poverty visited on the poorest among us. Walter Brueggemann, Old Testament scholar, refers to this capitalistic economy as an extraction economy, a system whereby what is possessed by the poor is quickly extracted from them and given to the rich and the wealthy. This collection of uncompensated or inadequately paid labor, taxes, fees, rents, interest, fines, assessments, and the profits from overpriced material goods of dubious value to physical and mental well-being is funneled upward to pad the growing accounts of those who occupy the highest economic strata. I thought about that the other day when I read about the growing wealth of Elon Musk. I don't know much about that in the particular case of that one man, but I know about it in general in terms of what I see in this society, where our society is becoming more and more changed in the direction of creating that very small, wealthy class and the very large, poor class. Middle class is being wiped out, essentially, as we think about it. Well, as David Garrow states, in the last 12 months of his life, King represented a far greater political threat to the reigning American government than he ever had before. And this was because he had gone to Memphis to organize garbage collectors who wanted fair pay. He had talked about the Vietnam War as being an immoral war, and he wanted it to stop. His brazen murder in 1968 demonstrates for all of us who would see the depths of commitment on the part of those who live off the sickness being played out. 10 years before his death, I had the opportunity to meet Dr. King. He came to Little Rock. He came there to talk to the group of 9 of us. Ernie Green, one of our group, was a senior that year. He graduated. The 8 of us, the remaining 8, were not allowed to attend that ceremony. That was considered too dangerous. But Dr. King went. It was supposed to be only Ernie and his immediate family. So Dr. King passed himself off as an uncle. It was early in his career. There weren't that many photos of him around. He could do it. Well, you know the old thing. They all look alike. At any rate, after the graduation, all of us who were unable to attend the ceremony met with Ernie and his family and Dr. King at the home of Daisy Bates. This was the Arkansas State NAACP president. And at her home, we used to gather there as a group of 9, actually. We spent a lot of time at our house because we were not allowed to participate in any extracurricular activities at school. So after school, we would go there to hang out, to sort of decompress and talk about the death threats and the attempts on our lives during that day. You know, it was a crazy year because we were told from the beginning we had no business here and we should leave. And if we chose not to leave, we would be killed and dragged out. So we lived under that threat every day. And I honestly, as a 15-year-old, thought I was going to wind up on some coroner's list on any given day. I didn't. And it's miraculous that none of us were killed. I can't explain to you how that happened. You know, I used to look around at these kids and think, you know, if they really wanted to, they could. I think there's something holding them back. And I really think it was divine intervention, to tell you the honest truth. Now, my thinking about what words to include in this talk were accompanied by my reading of the bicentennial edition of a book about the life of Frederick Douglass. It was actually his own autobiography. But his family, going forward, came together and decided to produce this bicentennial edition. But the main part in it is that Brian Stevenson, who is the CEO of his operation down in Alabama, he wrote this paragraph of introduction, and he says this: commentators routinely describe Douglass as one of the towering Negro leaders in American history. Get that resonance? King, Douglass. Without recognizing that this segregated view of greatness merely confirms the challenges we still face in the country today. Frederick Douglass is one of our nation's greatest leaders without qualification. His gifted moral reasoning for equality, uncontradicted by racist ideology and uncontaminated by gender bias, was articulated in the clearest, most consistent and authentic voice for equal justice in the 19th century. There's another book to read, by the way. He's got more than one autobiography, so we can read a lot. Dr. King sought to instill hope and to inspire people to know the truth and to speak truth to power. He was especially eloquent in his April 16, 1963 letter from Birmingham jail. Some of you read that. Plan that they confront the evils in society. You know, it's very interesting. Sometimes you're not quite sure what some ministers are thinking about. Down in Little Rock, I had a black minister confront me one day. He said, "Boy, you know you have no business up there," talking about Central. And I looked, because this was not a part of our conversation. And he says, "But since you're up there, you might as well stay." Then I thought, is this guy trying to hedge his bets with God? What's going on here? I don't know. But back to the letter from Birmingham jail. A group of clergymen had written a letter to Dr. King admonishing him for moving too fast. You should slow down and wait. And Dr. King penned an essay that might well be included in the social studies textbooks in Kentucky. In the letter, he respectfully addresses his fellow clergymen and invites them to consider the error of their ways. The 8 white clergymen who co-authored the letter to Dr. King represent that segment of the population characterized most prominently by the notion that black people are too much of a hurry to gain equal rights. Speaking directly to this strange observation, Dr. King writes, "Frankly, I have never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was well-timed, according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation." Later in the letter, Dr. King chastises the numerous religious leaders of some Southern congregations for telling their parishioners to comply with decisions banning segregation because it is the law. He expresses his longing that he would hear them say, "Follow this decree because integration is morally right, and the Negro is your brother." Well, that is an amazing kind of a thing, but again, much of that still happens in 2024. I remain confused about the message he intended to communicate. That was a minister who told me about being at Central. You know, I ponder that a lot because I have a great respect for the ministry and all that it represents. And I really want people to be more consistent. But that's a personal observation. Just throwing it in. Now, those of you familiar with Dr. King's use of biblical passages will recognize this verse as one he was very fond of quoting. The Old Testament prophet Amos writes in chapter 5, verse 24, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." You know, the visuals just blow you away when you think about that. Think of all this water rushing down, justice and mercy flowing over us. Amos's call demands a reappraisal of religion and religious priorities, raising social justice higher in the scale of values. That was an issue of the highest order for Martin Luther King. He was a modern-day prophet, urging the United States of America to rethink its commitment to the less fortunate among us. You know, as we drove up here today, in the snow and this cold, we were at the corner out here in the corner by the library, I've forgotten the street names. There were a couple of men, maybe 3 of them, trying to get into the library. But the door was locked. It was cold out there, and they were seeking warmth. This all flashed through my head. Now, I had an entry because I was an invited guest and went through a back door that was open. I told the men, "I'm going to go back and open the door for you," but I didn't have that power. And I think it would have been against the library rules, and I may have gotten into trouble. You know how that goes. I have to be careful. Maybe next time I will open that door. There is another story I want to share with you as we think about Martin Luther King's thinking. This comes out of the Second World War. Langdon Gilkey, the author of a book called Shantung Compound, tells of his life in a large Japanese internment camp in northern China during World War II. And there were about 1,500 detainees, a number of which were Americans. And they were largely the internees, the prisoners of war, that were left mainly to organize themselves, to make the rules for how they were going to exist socially and communally. And then one January 1945, a shipment of parcels came from the U.S., about 1,500 parcels, food and personal things like soap and so forth. And the Japanese commandant decided to give one of the packages to all of the internees, whether they were American or not. The Americans protested. They said, well, since it's coming from the U.S., we as Americans have the right to distribute it how we want. Well, they came up with a system that gave them the lion's share. The Americans were few in number compared to the whole group. They would get 5.5 packages each. That would leave 1/4 package for the rest of the people. And guess who was pushing for this plan? The Christian soldiers. They were the ones making the case. They were providing the ideological, the rational explanation for why this should be so. Wow. But that's how it is also many times. There were so many people who flew the flag of Christianity out, yelling at us at Central High School. I could just imagine them being in church on Sunday, preparing for their craziness on Monday. I don't know what they were told from the pulpit. I was not allowed to attend. I would imagine the contained outrage Dr. King would have to manage if he were to read about these prisoners of war. In 1967, Dr. King published Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? A pertinent question to have been asked 53 years ago or more, and no less pertinent today as we dance close to the edge of chaos every single day. And the notion of true community is as distant today as it was when his book was written. Allow me to share with you some of the language from that text. Loose and easy language about equality, resolutions about brotherhood fall pleasantly on the ear. But for the Negro, there is a credibility gap he cannot overlook. He remembers that with each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that the Negro has come far enough, not too far. Each step forward accents an ever-present backlash. This characterization is necessarily general. It would be grossly unfair to admit recognition of a minority of white people who genuinely want authentic equality. Their commitment is real, sincere, and is expressed in 1,000 deeds, but they're balanced on the other end of the pole by the unregenerated segregationists who have declared that democracy is not worth having if it involves equality. We're going to face that in November. We have to watch out for it to see how much of that is prescient truth spoken of by King years ago. America had a master race in the antebellum South. Reestablishing it with a resurgent Klan and a totally disenfranchised lower class would realize a dream of too many extremists on the right. The great majority of Americans are suspended between these two opposing attitudes. They're uneasy with injustice, but unwilling to pay a significant cost to eradicate it. One answer will be thrust upon us in November, as I said. But I would ask, can we wait that long? Martin Luther King Jr. waited until December 1967 to make public his opposition to the war in Vietnam. Now, he had felt opposition before that, but he wanted to do it in a way that didn't upset as many people. Didn't work. But that's just the way it goes. If you step outside the lines, who knows what may happen to you. Now, if we were willing to face the facts of our existence, it would be a messy kind of thing because our history is not the best reading possible. You know, as a young man in Little Rock, I used to ask a lot of questions. But many of the black people I questioned would respond this way: boy, don't bring that stuff up. You want to get us all killed? I was shocked. And I didn't want to participate in doing anything that would get anybody killed, especially myself. So I said, okay, I'm going to back off. I won't ask questions. I will not give up my quest. I committed myself through the auspices of my own learning academy, delve into the historical record, to soak myself in it. I wound up marrying a historian, perhaps with that in mind. And she has helped me in that quest. And together, we look at the historical record, not in terms of judging it, not in terms of trying to fix it, but simply to understand what happened. See, you need to know. Without doubt, we are imperfect. But even with this realization, we have pledged to create a more perfect union. That's in our history as well. We have said it. We've written it down. We sometimes talk as if we mean it. We want to establish a more perfect union. Dr. King dreamed about this. I dream about this, and I hope you do too. Because it is through your dreaming, your imagination, that the thing can take shape. Nothing happens without somebody who's willing to imagine it first, as a first step. It can't happen if you don't imagine it. And so, if we do, maybe so. About 4 years ago, my wife and I attended a lecture by Walter Mosley, fairly well-known author. Some of you know him. He said in his speech, as he ended his presentation, I invite each of you to consider tomorrow telling the truth at least once. And I almost stood up and yelled, hallelujah. Because I certainly would like to hear somebody speaking some truth sometime. We honor Dr. King by choosing his way of being in the universe. And we set a higher bar for all of those who are willing to emulate our truth-telling behavior. And what do you gain? John 8:32 tells us, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Thank you.